designated federal officer for the GSA Acquisition Policy Federal Advisory Committee. So our second meeting for the Policy and Practice Subcommittee. So it's been a busy December so far. And we wanted to let you know that as you join in, if you're not in the subcommittee, welcome. You're welcome to observe unless you're speaking and you have a speaking role today. We wanted to also say that we have a pretty active website, and feel free to go in and visit our website and see all the materials that we're uploading there. What I want to do, what I'm going to do is I'm going to postpone roll call. We'll do that later. Just give people an opportunity to get in here. Had a really great conversation yesterday with the Industry Partnership Subcommittee. And we wanted to sort of continue that conversation with Katie Miller here from GSA. Before doing that, though, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Steve Schooner and Luke Basis, who are co-chairing the Policy and Practice Subcommittee. One other note for public participants, we will provide some time for you all to chime in at the end. But again, just a reminder, this is a meeting of the subcommittee members of the Policy and Practice Subcommittee. So Professor Steve Schooner, I'll give it back to you.
So with your indulgence, I think Luke and I would prefer if we could jump right to Katie because she's on a short schedule and will in effect greet and deal with all the formalities later. But thanks so much. And thanks again, Katie, for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So basically, for those of you who weren't aware, Katie spoke at another one of the subcommittees yesterday and not surprisingly was terrific. We had a couple of offers outstanding for potential speakers, both of whom were unable to join us today. Katie agreed to join us on very short notice, and we dumped a significant number of questions on her. If you'd like, Katie, we're more than willing to let you just do as much of that as you can in 30 minutes and prioritize as you'd like. Or, of course, we can do it in any other way. But our goal is to let you talk as much as possible.
Okay. Oh, thanks so much. I really appreciate that. Yeah, I'm happy to run through the questions here. Do you want me to just kind of read out the question and the response? That works?
So Katie, if I can make a suggestion, because many of the people will be new in this one, so people that didn't see you yesterday, so it might be good to introduce yourself and just let them know kind of your role at GSA, and so they know a little bit about you before the questions.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Boris, for that reminder. So my name is Katie Miller. I'm the Senior Leader for Climate for GSA's Federal Acquisition Service. So this is the side of the agency that primarily handles contracting and government-wide contracts for federal customers. So my role is to kind of lead the climate and sustainability work for FAS, and then also think about, how do we build this foundation for continued work in sustainability and climate moving forward. And so yesterday I spoke with the Industry Partnerships Group and kind of talked a little about FAS and what we're doing in climate and sustainability, as well as walk through some examples of what we've done with industry partnerships, lots of different types of examples we've done over a good chunk of time, and then talked about some of the challenges that we've identified and have in that space. So I think some of the questions that were developed by this group have come out of the conversation yesterday. So the first question that I received here was, there's a fair amount of research out there that suggests that DoD is the world's largest GHG emitter because that's defense. Does that simply fall outside of GSA's world? Could you say a word or two about this? So DoD is definitely, it's one of our biggest customers, so it does somewhat fall within our scope. I would say though, like when it comes to, aircraft and weapon systems and procurements like that, that's not something that we're selling to DoD. That's something they're doing within DoD. And I know that Katie Newhouse, I don't know if you've spoken with her from CEQ. Okay. She's interested in this topic area as well. And have you spoken with Carrie Meyer from DoD by chance?
No, but thanks for that suggestion. We'll blame you when we call her.
Yeah, good. So
and I can make that connection for us too.
Oh, that'd be
great, Jenny. Thanks.
Yeah, so she's also interested in that space and trying to figure out that question for DoD. One of the other questions was, no harm in asking or potential hypothetical. Essentially, how would you feel about a nudge or a change in some of the federal acquisition rules so that purchases must be made through GSA's GSA Advantage, our online purchasing tool, the environmental aisle that we have on there, or the purchaser would have to do some extra work, say like file a paper or saying why they didn't purchase. I'm guessing that question is why they didn't purchase the compliant product. So I think this is an interesting idea, and I'd share two things on this. I think in a perfect world, GSA Advantage, that environmental aisle I talked about yesterday, would be the default easy way to purchase the compliant product. In practice, and what I shared yesterday, kind of some of our challenges are, we know that some of the environmental icon accuracy, and so we call environmental icons on GSA Advantage, those are like the designations you see on there that a product is compliant with a certain federal green purchasing requirement. Those are not always accurate. We know we need to do some work in that space to get those accurate and to really identify all the compliant sustainable products. But in some instances, we get that direct feed from the environmental labeling organization, and we can do, a good match between what's an advantage and what the supplier is putting up there and what meets the federal green purchasing requirements. But we don't have that for many of those labels. So a lot of the vendors self-designate those items, and that's where we run into this problem where, you're a vendor on there, you're trying to check all of the boxes that you can, right? And so sometimes they don't understand what that means. And so, we get some inaccurate labeling, and we're trying to work through that and figure out how to address that. And for that second part of the question, with, doing the extra work, it made me think of the Energy Policy Act of 2005 in section 104. There's flavors of this in there. So this requires federal agencies to purchase only Energy Star and Federal Energy Management Program, that's a DOE program, designated products, energy efficient products. And for the exceptions to that, it does state that, if an agency isn't able to purchase the Energy Star or FEMP designated product because it's not cost effective while taking into account energy cost savings, or if it's not reasonably available and to meet the functional requirements of the agency, that exception needs to be in writing from the head of the agency. And I think that was written in there to intentionally deter people from not buying the compliant product. I mean, who wants to go to the head of their agency and say, can you sign this so I can buy, a non-Energy Star TV or whatever it is. I don't know in practice how well that is happening, but I think I like this idea that you brought up here, because that brings up the fact that enforcement of these policies and tracking these policies and making sure that we're getting that desired outcome is a big challenge, because there really isn't a central place right now for tracking that necessarily. There was a question on the GSA Federal Contractor Climate Action Scorecard that I showed you yesterday. I would say for that one, Jed Ela, I don't know if you've spoken with him. So he is the lead for that scorecard, and he just expanded that to include some more information. I would talk to him to get his take on what he thinks it's saying or not, because he sits in this data every year to create that scorecard.
Excuse me just for a moment. So Boris and Stephanie, I know that Jed's name has come up a number of times before. I actually think it's a great suggestion. I'll add it to the list. But okay, anyway, thanks.
And I have connected with Jed some time ago, and he works for the high performing green buildings group in Office of Government-Wide Policy. So yeah, he will be a good one.
And for anyone who met Betty and Katie recently, he was over in that position before. So.
Yeah. So I would chat with him about that, and he can give you, I'm sure he can give you a good read on that over time too, how things may have changed. So for the next question is on, it looks like a lot of big contractors are engaged with SBTI. I think that's also part of the scorecard question, and I know Jed can talk about that a bit. And that I do want to also note that there was a question in here too about, you know, are there alternatives to it? That's a question that we have in the FAR case right now, in FAR case 2021-015, which is currently out for public comment. It's asking that same question. So I just wanted to note that is a question that's out there, and we're asking the public for more feedback on in that FAR case. With regard to the green procurement compilation and or the SF tool, the sustainable facilities tool, are they the same thing? Is there a difference? Is there a plan to phase out any confusion there? So the green procurement compilation is a tool that is housed within the SF tool. It's like a module of the tool. It has a very specific function to kind of walk federal purchasers as well as suppliers now through the various green purchasing requirements that we have. And there's some sample contract language in there as well. And just to kind of make that process a little bit easier. The question here about to phase out the confusion, is the confusion over, are they separate tools, or what's the confusion over?
Well, when you actually go to the GPC, it actually says SF tool in the top left-hand corner.
Yeah.
And I have to say, since I drive a lot of people there, I consistently hear from people, which is it? Are they the same thing? I like your description that the GPC is a module of the SF tool, but conceptually in terms of macro and micro, that feels exactly backwards to me, but in any event.
Gotcha. Okay. Gotcha. Okay, that's good to know. Yeah, well, that's good feedback for us. And I see Julie Volney is on the line here from our office as well, and she's manages the green procurement compilation. So Julie, maybe that's something we can chat about later. And then usage statistics on that. We do for the green procurement compilation, we do have those. We would need to pull them. If you let me know specifically like what kind of metrics you're looking for, we can get you some information on that. And if you don't have that at the moment, that's fine. But if you send some over as things you'd like to know, we can certainly pull that. We can try and pull to the best what we've got. Let's see. With regard to the 3-part webinar.
But before you get to that one, the last sub bullet under the GPC SF tool. So one thing that came up before is I hear from time to time there's frustration that the GPC doesn't drive people through the environmental aisle, or in other words, it gives me the information, but it's not one-stop shopping. We were kind of curious to hear what efforts are being made to create the one-stop solution.
Yeah, I can't get into too many details. I'd say like at this point, we're looking into options for this. It's definitely on our radar that is something that our federal customers within FAS are looking for. And we're in the process of doing some research to just kind of better understand this. I will say, like, if we drive people to the environmental aisle, we then run into the problem that we have with, making sure that everything that is labeled as a sustainable product on there indeed is. So I think we've got to, there's several things that we'll need to kind of get in place in order to do something like this. See, for the 3-part webinar on managing greenhouse gas emissions that FAS did along with EPA back in February 2022, do we have any ideas of usage on that? The YouTube data suggests over 600 hits. So I am not aware that we have usage data beyond that the YouTube statistics, but I can check on that and see if we have anything else. I don't think that we do, though. Make a note here for myself. The next question says in the chat.
And if I could interrupt just for a second, and particularly for the subcommittee, then the next question basically opens the door to learning curve and topical issues, and it's pretty open-ended, and there's lots of pieces of it. So if people could be thinking about this and being ready to follow up with questions in terms of topical interest, I think that would be great if that's an option.
Sure. So this is in the chat with the Industry Partnership Subcommittee, you spoke to the issue of the learning curve. That's one of the challenges we definitely have. Could you address all of these from your perspective? So the first question is, other than both, do you see greater return on investment in trying to drive government officials, including the acquisition workforce, program managers and leaders, or the private sector up the learning curve? I mean, there's definitely value in doing both. I know that's kind of punting on the question there. I will say, though, in thinking about one of the other challenges that I outlined yesterday, which is that, we have this challenge that this is not a priority of every administration, that perhaps, we might see greater return on investment focusing on the private sector. That is just my personal opinion, and I would say I'm sure that you'll hear other opinions on this. But I would say, since there is, in the private sector, if they're moving in that direction already, trying to become more sustainable, you may see that continue to happen, especially if they have other customers outside of the federal government. That may continue to grow if this, shifts priorities in another administration. So, but again, that's just my personal opinion there. Is sustainable food on GSA's radar screen? Many other countries are prioritizing this, not just a drive towards reducing scope 3 food impacts and more encouraging plant-based diets. So for this one, I would talk to someone in GSA's public building service perhaps about this. We don't really work in this space within FAS, but the public building service does have some cafeterias in their buildings, so they might be, they might be a source of some information on if there's any focus on that within GSA in terms of what we provide as an agency.
Yeah, and I do have a contact at PBS that I'm pursuing right now, so that's a group that I'm pursuing.
Great, thanks, Boris. And then the last question here is, what disciplines do you consider the highest priority? And there's a list of greenhouse gas measurement, assessment, disclosure, and targeting, tools to enhance the use of approved eco-label products from the GSA schedule to the SF tool, then more of like a buildings question on lead construction and buildings, out of the box, ranging from repurposed roofs for solar or tree green space, open areas on government land for solar potentially, disincentivizing driving, disincentivizing flying, incentivizing use of public transportation, et cetera, and others. And so is this question the disciplines, is this disciplines for...
And if it'll help, one of the things that this nascent subcommittee is trying to do is prioritize. Mm-hmm. And so we know we can't eat the elephant by the 1st of January. And we also know our marching orders from Jeff Kosis were, what he really wanted was something relatively quick and soon and something longer term. But realistically, we're probably only going to get to focus on a small number of things. So what we don't want to do is just drown. And we're still open at this point, to guidance as to what you think is important.
And with this, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, and I guess that on the one hand, my personal perspective is with regard to sustainable procurement. We're in an all hands on deck crisis moment in terms of climate change. And so the correct answer is we need to be focusing on all of these things. Mm-hmm. But this subcommittee and this committee can't do that. Mm-hmm. So in the context of GSA, for example, knowing that we can't fix the Defense Department, right? So
Right.
what types of things do you think would help you, would help Jeff and the like, given that at the end of the day, we're just a committee?
Gotcha. Okay, that's helpful. So this one I would definitely like, I definitely want to think more on this because that's a really important question. You know, and I'd love to give like a better nuanced question, answer to your question. Especially because it also involves areas outside of the Federal Acquisition Service. So like maybe we can give you a better, like broader GSA answer on this. One thing I would mention though, is climate risk. I know isn't on here, but and I think about that in terms of also the way the task force on climate related financial disclosures looks at this, which is or TCFD. You know, they look at this in terms of climate risk as the physical risk, you know, the physical impacts of climate change, you know, increased extreme precipitation events, storms, droughts, you know, those sorts of things, wildfires, and the impacts on an organization from that perspective. But then there's also the transition risk piece, which is focused on the risks associated with transitioning to a low or no carbon economy. And I think that the framework's useful because it kind of covers both the, you know, the greenhouse gas reduction side, but then also we are going to experience the impacts of climate change. How do we prepare for that and adapt to? And I think one of the benefits too of the TCFD recommendations, you know, that was really born out of the G20 Financial Stability Board because they see this as a global financial risk. And that's why this task force was set up, and connecting that to the financial piece, I think is a good way of driving us forward and into the future, right? When we can show that there's a financial risk to all of this, I think is important too. And I just mentioned that because I didn't see that listed here on here, but I definitely want to think more about that question as a whole and get back to you on that.
And at the risk of being abrupt, I just want to mention to the subcommittee members that Katie is with us for another 6 minutes. So I see that Rich Butel has his hand up, but if you think you have something you want to ask, go ahead and pop your hand up, your electronic hand, but go ahead, Rich.
Yeah, Katie, hi, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. It seems as if the primary approach to addressing greenhouse gas emission reductions and the like currently in place is the use of these third-party accreditation standards, such as LEEDs or EIT, many of which are self-attested and therefore often of dubious credibility and the like. And my question is that business model really the best or only way we can go about solving this problem? And I'm referencing specifically a detailed briefing I'd obtained this week from Matt Verholtz at the GSA Office of Infotech about how they're designing Alliant 3 as the next big GWAC government-wide acquisition contract. And Dean Schooner had also mentioned OASIS to bake in greenhouse gas emissions into the A2 requirements, into the structure of the GWAC as a fundamental business model that would both augment and reinforce the use of these third-party accreditations such as LEEDs and EPEAT. So I'm curious what your thoughts are about not a paradigm shift, but really considering as these new large vehicles are stood up across government, how can we bake this in to the requirements and demand generation that flows out of these vehicles going forward? Over.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that's something that we're trying to tackle too in the Federal Acquisition Service. So we have a acquisition council, the Federal Acquisition Service Acquisition Council, what we call the FAC. And it reviews our major large acquisitions like the ones you mentioned, like Alliant and OASIS Plus that are coming through. And it's a review process of each phase of the acquisition cycle. And we are leveraging that for the large $100 million plus external government-wide contracts to make sure that from the very beginning, they're screened for greenhouse gas and climate risk and sustainable procurement requirements to make sure that these sorts of things get into those. And that's what you're starting to see come out of, with Alliant and OASIS Plus. So I think that that is kind of one way we're trying to bake that in but this is as they're either, new contracts are being, solicitations are being pulled together, or they're being recompeted. We're not going back and modifying the existing contract, but as these new ones are coming through, we're trying to make sure as they go out, they have some of these requirements in them. And you have a really good point about the third party kind of verification of some of these claims. So that actually was part of, back in 2010, GSA released a report, and again, this is a little dated now, but I think it's kind of some of the same concerns on whether we could ask our vendors and our contractors to disclose their greenhouse gas emissions and how we could use that in the procurement process. And the recommendations that came out of the report in part were like this phased approach where we start asking, are you even reporting your emissions? And then moving to, sharing where they are, and then eventually requiring them, and then also having them third-party verified, having those emissions third-party verified. So we did, we definitely saw back then the utility of having that third-party verification on things to make sure that it's, we're actually getting what we're asking for. And I think that's part of what the FAR case that's out there right now is asking that question with some of these third-party standards. Should the government, they're proposing to use those and they're looking for feedback on that right now through that public comment process.
If she'll indulge us, we probably have time for one more question if someone has one. Well, let's be, if no one else has a question, I'm more than willing to be, or I'd like to at least try to be respectful of your time. Would love to take you up on more thoughts on the open-ended question. And obviously, at least from my perspective, you'd be welcome back to talk with us anytime. So again, thanks so much for your time. And I'm going to encourage the group to check out her slides from yesterday in the industry subcommittee. Thanks so much, Katie.
Oh, thank you all so much, and I wish you all happy holidays. Bye.
Thank you, Katie. Really appreciate it. And as Steve said, I did drop the link to the slides. Can you all hear me okay? All right. I dropped the link to the slides in the chat, which we put those on the website. Just a reminder, we're doing our best to put in materials on the website as soon as we get it, so it's an active space. I wanted to continue on with the process here real quickly. And what I want to do is do a quick roll call here. And I'm just going to go through names and do present if you are here, just to see who's here today. So I'm going to start. I see Luke Basis. Luke, am I saying your name correctly? Yeah.
Bassis.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Luke Bassis. Okay.
Thank you.
I got you. Luke Bassis. Richard Butel.
Oh,
All right. Leslie Cordes. Antonio Das. Mark Hayden.
I believe Mark just dropped. He was with us initially, but he said he had to go to a conflicting meeting.
Okay.
But I think he gets credit for at least
All
partial
right.
attendance.
Hey, that was the best part, right? Okay. Mamie Mallory. Okay. Emlan McCurdy. Jenny Romer. See Jenny there.
Here.
Stephen Schooner, of course. Stacy Smedley.
Present.
All right. Nigel Stephens. Anish Tilak. David Wagger. I see David.
Present.
And Kimberly White. All right. And I did hear from a couple of these folks that were traveling. Understandably, we're in the holiday season right now. So I want to pass it back to Steve and Luke to kind of continue our discussions here. Steve, back to you.
So I apologize. I'm just doing my normal tech foibles here as I try to move things around on my screen. But kind of interesting, we had perfect attendance at our last meeting and let's say less than perfect attendance at this meeting. So I don't know what conclusions to draw from that, but thanks to everybody who is here. I'm gonna lean on Luke very, very heavily here when we actually get to the important work in just a moment. But I guess I want to say a few things up front to those who are here and to anyone who's watching this a little bit later. And I say this in part from having sat in on the other subcommittee meetings. I think in the big picture, we have a lot of work to do, and we need to not only get started, but to somehow pick up the pace. And so one thing that I think we should at least think about, and we're open to input on, is whether we should be meeting alternative weeks for administrative meetings, even if only for an hour. And by the way, I do take the point that people are traveling for the holidays and that there is an epic storm in almost everyone's lives except for Boris, but I'm not going to rub that in. But in any event, the big committee is expecting stuff from us in a couple of months. We need to kind of get started. So we talked about 3 big tasks in the last meeting. And I mean, with all due respect, we didn't get much feedback on any of the 3 of them. So we're going to spend some more time with each of them today, but we have a mission statement, we have a speaker list that we're starting to work on, and topical priorities. And bottom line is we didn't get much input on that. And I think what you're all going to find is that Luke and I are more than willing to drive this train, and we have more than enough ideas to keep everyone fully occupied. But my understanding is everybody's here voluntarily, so much rather be focusing on the things that everyone's interested in. I do want to take one moment, and we can come back to this as a discussion issue later, but one thing that's, I don't want to call this an elephant in the room issue, but one thing that caught me a little bit off guard in the other subcommittees is that the small business issue, which is obviously a massive issue in public procurement, is dominant in the other committees. And I'm increasingly coming to think, and I think Luke is agreeing on this, but I think we're coming to think that we may be best served in literally ceding that issue to the industry engagement group. Because if all of the committees start focusing on small business engagement, then we're basically not doing what we were supposed to do and divide and conquer with our subcommittees. So again, my sense is that industry partnership is very, very much focused on that. And part of me thinks that as a group, we might want to think about agreeing to affirmatively leave that field or that space to them. The other things I just briefly want to mention is that, as Boris mentioned, the shared folders are being nicely populated at this point. And so you can find information on any of the meetings that you've missed. And one of the things that we've been trying to do is to also supplement the folders with supplemental reading that may be of interest on some of the big topics that we are talking about here and in the plenary committee, and also with some news items. Like, for example, I assume by now everybody is aware of the administration's massively high-profile success in turning the corner, in large part, on the Postal Service NGDV, the Next Generation Delivery Vehicle, the electrification of much of the fleet. That's a pretty big deal. And to some extent, and I can say this particularly from outside the country, people weren't taking the United States serious on sustainable procurement while the Postal Service was off buying 150,000 fossil fuel burning trucks. But if in fact this suggests that we're getting momentum and the worm is turning, I think that that's good leverage for us. But again, the last point I want to make on that is if you have thoughts about what we should be populating in the file, we'd love to know. I see David has his hand up.
Yes, thank you recognizing me. On the news about the Postal Service going to purchase a large number of electric vehicles, presumably for mail distribution and other things. Yes, it might replace internal combustion engine vehicles, but if the electricity itself is made with fossil fuels, then you kind of got the efficiency trade-off question is it better net or is it really emission shifting? And I guess the question is that a policy that we would say that if you're going to go to EVs, you must also procure greener electricity than your default electricity that you would get? Because that's kind of an unknown question, at least in my naive view.
Well, so first of all, I think it's a great question. And I think that the related questions on this are, and again, this is what I was trying to get to in the last questions to Katie earlier. You could make the argument that, and we just talked about this if you look in the chat to Mark's comments earlier, if we think about this in terms of requirements rather than procurement, why aren't we also talking about fewer trucks and replacing them with cargo bikes and e-bikes like they're doing in Germany and other countries? And why aren't we having a serious conversation about reducing the amount of junk mail, which is why we need so many trucks in the first place, because it's the model that the Postal Service depends on. But I think to David's point, all of these policies have byproducts and second order externalities and the like. My question on all these things is, what is within the zone of our capability? So I don't have a good answer for you, and I'm more than willing to discuss it, but I think it's a great issue to be raised. Okay, so let me just say one other thing, and then I'm gonna shut up at least for a minute and let Luke go. But again, I would love for us to at least make a little progress on the mission statement and get that, I don't want to say behind us, but out of the way sooner rather than later. And at least one of the committees have already basically achieved that. And then I also just very briefly want to say that what we're going to start doing soon, and we learned our lesson in terms of scheduling for this meeting, is we want to extend a number of invitations for speakers. So there's some on there, but most members of the subcommittee haven't suggested either. And there are 3 suggestions on there I just want to briefly comment on and get some feedback on before we leave that. One suggestion was about bringing someone in from the procurement roundtable. And I have to say I was intrigued by that because we have at least two members of the procurement roundtable on this subcommittee. So I'm not sure that we need to do that, but I see no reason why we couldn't ask the procurement roundtable for a letter or a list of topics. But I don't know that they have an obvious speaker, which leads me to the key point here, which is if you think you want to hear from a group, try to be as specific as possible about the individual that you're looking for and what you think they would talk about. Similarly, there was a suggestion about the George Mason Center. And I don't know where that came from, but my understanding is Rich Butel is associated with the center. So part of me feels like they're represented here. And it's also unclear to me that this is a focus issue for them yet. But again, the larger point is, let's try to be as specific as possible as to what we want from the speakers. The last one I'll mention, and I mentioned this earlier, is there was a great suggestion there about small business perspective. And again, I come back to the issue, which is going to be a committee decision, as to whether this committee can actually deal with small business issues or whether we should let the industry participation group drive that train. So I'll stop there. I see Rich's hands up, and then I'll turn it over to Luke.
Steve, I think one thing that would help us a lot would be to do some benchmarking with industry regarding the best practices and constructive and successful strategies that they have been utilizing in their supply chain to reduce carbon emissions. And toward that end, I've been running some trap lines with our good colleague, Trissa Thompson, formerly of Dell, ran their sustainability. And she's giving the names of some top-notch private sector folks who can advise us as to industry best practices to educate ourselves for benchmarking purposes.
But you're not thinking of bringing Trissa in herself. You're using her for other contacts. I
hadn't thought to do that. I asked her for some ideas, and she's given me the name already of one individual, which I need to vet a little bit before I forward them. But I'd love to bring Trissa in. She'd be great, but she's kind of retired at this point. But whatever. Okay, but thanks. I think that's a great path to follow. Thanks for that. Yeah.
David, I see David's hands up again.
Yes, thank you. On the question of small, and I think maybe when we talked about it in the industry partnerships, it was small, minority, women-owned, and disadvantaged businesses, kind of all of those, and they have their different attributes, but I just want to collectively refer to them, is that I'm not sure we should cede that to industry partnerships in the following way, is that it might be, we set a policy such as we should help those businesses that would like help, let's say, developing things like EPDs and other kinds of certifications that they'll have in order to, that might be the policy that we set, but the industry partnerships and then would create a program that helps do that. So I'm not sure sort of which one is do we set by policy tell what IP does, or IP says we want to do this and you should have a policy to do that? I just don't know how that dynamic works.
I don't know either, but I think that one of the questions we have to try to decide as a group is what we think we can do and where we think we can make a contribution. So Luke, do you want to pick up and go to mission statement or topics, or should we?
Yeah. I think that's actually a perfect transition, because I think for those of us that have sat through some of the other meetings, I think we'll find that A informs B informs C, right? If we don't have a mission statement that we all agree upon and are enthusiastic about, then it becomes a lot more difficult to talk about how we are going to prioritize issues and how we are going to, say, pick areas for education, areas to get smarter about, areas to make recommendations about. And so I think we have this, a fundamental, like there is so much, and it is so overwhelming. And I think, the breadth of what we have heard so far has really, I think raised at least my collective IQ on these topics, that I think, I would love if we could go through an exercise now and try to get to a conclusion on the mission statement, because I think that's going to drive a lot of progress elsewhere. Boris, I'm not able on my technology to pull up kind of the working draft that was.
Yeah, I'm glad to do that. I'll pull it up.
I appreciate that. Thank you. The other question I'd like to keep in our pocket for later, touching on what the professor said, is that, how can we as leaders of this committee drive more engagement with you guys? So we putting a document out there is a tool that's available, but it isn't exactly proactive. So I want to figure out how we can tap into each one of you, because there was nothing more impressive than listening to your backgrounds at that first meeting. And if we are not able to extract your experience and your knowledge from each one of you to inform everything that comes out of this committee, then we're not doing our jobs, and we're not making this the best effort that we could possibly make.
Hey, can I just for 1 second? Hey, Boris, and I think we had talked about this before, and I apologize if I wasn't clear. Could you briefly pop up the acquisition workforce mission statement? And I only suggest that because they're, as I understand it, the furthest ahead. And so I think it would be great for us to see the group that we're trailing, just to use it as an example. We don't have to use the same example, but I think that would be great. Sorry, Luke.
Yep. No. Have they gotten to the point where they voted yet, or is it just kind of in final draft form?
I think they're done.
Great. Good.
Yeah, they are done. Let me share my screen. There it is. Can you all see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So this is acquisition workforce.
Empower and equip the federal acquisition workforce to prioritize environmental outcomes and promote sustainability throughout the acquisition lifecycle.
And again, one thing that, because I was lurking in that meeting, they were very much focused on brevity. They were attempting to be inclusive. There was a lot of discussion on including both prioritizing environmental outcomes and promoting sustainability because of the perceived difference that so many people in the marketplace had with regard to those two things. Many seem to think the sustainability included them, but enough people thought that they were different that they decided to include both. But other than that, it's not very many words and it doesn't say that many things. Conversely, they're done with the project and we aren't. But
I really like that, and I think it's very powerful in that you can almost replace the first sentence and make it the mission of the Policy and Practice Subcommittee. Is to make recommendations that prioritize environmental. It's very. I could. They did a good job. So I'll leave it to the subcommittee. If we could put our draft back up, there's just an alternative draft here with some of the concepts we discussed last time. And I don't want to put anybody, make anybody uncomfortable, but, since this is really the forum, I think where people have had the best opportunity to speak, I would like to go around and circle and maybe get everybody's 2 cents on what they would like to see change with, say, this latest one or what we're missing. And keeping, at least my recommendation, an eye on how broad and powerful and curtly worded that last one we read was. I think that was very effective with a very, very limited amount of words. I'm looking at David Wagger first on my screen here. David, you have any? What are your thoughts?
I was hoping I would go last like I usually do because I'm W. So I perhaps should turn over my time to somebody else and let me think about this a little bit more. I've spoken enough already today,
all right,
so
that sounds good.
Thank you.
All right, well, I see Jenny Romer next on my my screen here. Obviously not in alphabetical order. So Jenny, what do you think?
I support actionable in there. And yeah, I think keeping it as succinct as we can while still getting the point across, I think is helpful. And I support I think specifying climate is helpful there. So it's climate and sustainability, even though I see climate as part of sustainability. So I don't have any additional suggestions at this point, but I'm curious to hear what others have to say.
Okay. For me, and I will continue going on in the room, the end of it is a little awkward. Significant and measurable impact in support of climate and sustainability action. I can't put my finger on it. It just sounds a little weird to me. So if there's any improvements anyone can think of along those lines, that would be great. Let's see who's next here. Richard Butel. Well, Richard, you've spoken already too. Let's go to we'll come to you at the end with David. My goodness, I can't see any of their names. Steve,
Luke, I just raised my hand. I don't know if you could see that, but I'm willing to talk if it's
all right. Fantastic. Go for it, Stacy.
So I think, my struggle is always the need for a mission statement to be broad, but also to be specific enough that you're actually doing something and that is telling you what you're trying to actually accomplish. So my issue with the last part is climate and sustainability action can mean a whole bunch of things. But are we talking about reducing environmental impacts? Are we talking about reducing carbon emissions? Are we talking about mitigating risk? I know we can do bullet points after this, but to me, it's almost a little too broad because there's so much that we could define those things to be. But I wonder if there's a way for us to be just a little bit more specific in what we mean by that. So I don't have the answer to that. It's just, I had the same struggle. It's just, depending on who you talk to, that last bit of climate and sustainability action could mean about 100 things. And we can't focus on 100 things. So could the mission statement be a little bit more specific?
Can we go back? Can we just flash back to the acquisition workforce one? How did they address it?
And remember, I've dropped it into the chat if anybody needs them, rather than toggle if you want it.
Prioritize environmental outcomes and promote sustainability throughout the acquisition lifecycle. Okay. All right. So who's next? I'm having trouble scrolling through the visitors. So I guess we'll.
I think we have 2 Davids, don't we? Or is the other David not a subcommittee member? I get this. I get the
Yeah.
subcommittee and the plenary mixed up.
Yeah, I'm with the support team, Professor Schooner. Thank you.
I think you have to go back to Rich and David then.
Looks like Rich and David are next in line. All right, so let's go to Richard first.
This smack to me is a kind of a philosophical issue here. This mission statement sounds like we're going to do top-down command and control work to create additional regulatory overhead. And what I think we need to be focusing on is demand generation to create the demand in the private sector to step up to our goals and objectives in that sense. And so I had added a couple words, which I don't have here in front of me, on the share drive, that suggested that what we want to do is to create actionable changes to the FAR policies and practices that will create private sector demand for goods and services that support and sustain climate sustainability. Wording to that effect, I'm paraphrasing. So it was a philosophical nuance about the approach that we're taking.
Can you stay with that thought for a second, Rich? And I just dropped something into the chat. I've been a little bit taken aback by how strong and almost visceral the reaction has been to any discussion of anything that's already in front of the FAR Council. And so there's this part of me that is almost feeling like when we say changes to the federal acquisition regulations, as opposed to Rich's point, policies and practices, I feel like we've almost got our foot up against a third rail. The other thing is the FAR Council moves slowly. They've got, we talked about this earlier, they have one case that's already out as a proposed rule. They have another one that's apparently coming soon. And that's a pretty long lead item. But I'm increasingly wondering whether we want to be thinking more in terms of policy and practice. And again, I don't want to throw in the towel if you think there's hope here, but I'm getting anxious about committing to try to create actionable changes to the federal acquisition regulations because I think it's just too big for us.
And I would say too specific for a mission statement, committing to that level of change. I think our mission, as it was laid out in one of the earlier notices, is policies and practices. So at least for our purposes at this point, the broad language I think gives us the capability to find tools later on. But I don't know, A is going to drive B, and we need to tap into, what you guys think is the best appropriate path forward. David, I think you're the last one left here, so you're up, my friend.
Well, thank you. All great comments. Those things had percolated in my head as well. I noticed that the workforce acquisition, that's the acquisition workforce statement, mentioned environmental and sustainability, not climate and sustainability. And I don't know if that's a significant difference, but I thought that was interesting.
Hey, David, can we take that one? And again, we'll come back to you on the broader issues, but I was surprised by how much time they spent on that. And as I suggested earlier, I was surprised that they ultimately agreed on the two-part phrase, environmental outcomes and sustainability. I don't know that all of the subcommittees need to be parallel or consistent. And I think there's the distinct possibility that issue could percolate up at the plenary committee level. But they were surprisingly intentional in not using the phrase climate change and in using that two-part phrase. It's not what I would have done, but I don't want to suggest that by any means that was an accident when they did that.
No. I thought it was an interesting choice. And I imagine it's things like the climate, water, food nexus. And you can see about that all over the social media, depending on where you look. So I can understand that. Yeah, I thought significant and measurable, that suggests that maybe we'd have kind of an auditing. I mean, measurable by whom? There are things that are implied in these words, and I'm not sure that they need to be spelled out so much. Yeah, I have to noodle this more. This is I thought it was interesting about going to the regulations, and maybe that's implied, is that what else would the policies and practices impact? I mean, is this something that would be outside regulation that GSA?
Well, so if I could just offer one on that, and I'm sure Rich has others as well, but it's a shame we don't have Ann Rung with us in this committee. But what OFPP has done from time to time when they don't make regulations is they do promulgate policies and practical guidance. So, for example, acquisition professionals at the federal level are familiar with the periodic Mythbusters memos. So what we often find is that risk-averse contract professionals think the regulations tell them to do one thing, and they're just wrong. So you can dramatically influence policy and practice without having to go through the regulatory process by basically saying, hey, look, when the reg says this, it doesn't mean this, it means this. And one of the points that I've made, and if you're interested, we can do this another day, there's a slide in the reference materials for our subcommittee. There's a slide I use of all the things that we could be doing with regard to sustainable procurement that don't require waiting for the FAR Council. And again, I'm just personal opinion here again, I think one of the biggest mistakes we can make is sitting back and waiting for the FAR Council to solve our problems. I think that everything that matters in sustainable procurement can be addressed without the FAR Council. And again, I point, for example, to the point that Rich made. Changing the way we think about requirements will have a much greater impact than changing the way we structure our evaluation criteria. Because if we ask for different things, we'll get different things. But again, that's a long-winded answer there, and I don't know if that helps or not.
And the other thing is, and thank you, I appreciate that, is the other thing is actionable changes. Is actionable kind of an advocacy word? Are there changes that are inactionable? I'm just trying to wrap my head around, how would I know an actionable change from an inactionable or a non-actionable change?
I have two quick comments on this as well. I think you make a really important point. We should think about it. I think the actionable came from our original discussion with Jeff Kozis at GSA, because I think that was our mandate. I think that a lot of people in federal procurement, one of the most cynical reactions you're going to get is, my personal opinion, we can rewrite FAR Part 23 all we want and nothing's going to happen. If we only rewrite FAR Part 23 and we don't talk about FAR Part 1 or FAR Part 7 or FAR Parts 12, 13, 14, and 15, or some of the others, FAR Part 9, for example, nothing changes. So you can change the regulations a lot. And I think a good example is almost everything in FAR Part 23 today is ignored. And a lot of it is objectively out of date and wrong. So we could change the federal regulations without changing policy and practice. And I think that's exactly what we don't want to do. Now, whether we decide to embrace Jeff's mandate or not, I don't know that we can do everything, but I think they're really important points.
So let me add something, David. One of the things about actionable is we're thinking about things that GSA can do. So when we're saying actionable, so when you turn in some recommendations to us as a result of your work, it's like, wow, this is something that GSA could actually do something with. And so that's really where that actionable was coming from when Jeff and me and Stephanie talk about that word, just to clarify.
I appreciate that. And that reminds me of Luke, what you said. Maybe the problem, at least with actionable, is it really the changes that will have significant and measurable impact are by definition presumably actionable. And maybe it's the distance between actionable changes and the significant measurable, it's the problems that are not closely connected in the sentence. But I think that changes that have a significant and measurable impact are by definition actionable. I would think that's what the outcome of that is. So maybe that's kind of where some level of, can't point your finger at it, but I'm just wondering about sort of those things are far apart in the sentence. You have to get through the intermediate part to get to what the changes do.
Yeah, so I think this is, so if I'm going to sit, if I'm sitting in the seat of a you know, a policy maker, and at the end of this process where, you know, we're coming up with a list of recommendations, the process I'm probably going through in my head is looking one by one. The first one, all right, how much work is it going to take to get that done? A little bit of work, that's actionable. Okay, what's the impact going to be? High. Is it going to be measurable? Because we have to be able to measure where we were yesterday and where we were today. And if there's a difference, then we know it will be a success, right? I think that's, if I'm just at the end of this, looking back at the recommendations that are going to come out of this committee, that's how I'm going to read those three concepts. Now, I don't know if practically that's how it's done in the real world, but I think that's kind of where, when I see these three words in this way, that's how I'm reading it. And maybe there's a better way to arrange it, because I think we can recommend things that are actionable, that'll have no impact, or that will have no ability to measure. And then we won't necessarily be able to claim a success at the end of the day, because, you know, there'll be no KPI upon which we'll be claiming a success. And maybe that's not important in every circumstance, but if I'm a policymaker, that's almost how I'm calculating which I'm going to accept and which I'm not going to accept, and which is going to, you know, what might be low-hanging fruit and what might not be. But I am not a policymaker. So, Jenny, how about you? I think it's your turn.
I would say the highlighted red federal acquisition regulations. I mean, I think that specificity, I don't think we really need and would be the major part here. So I would vote for removing that part, but I would keep actionable. And I think part of the question is, and I think we can talk about this more, but I think that actionable to me lends itself more towards small changes. And so I think the question for the subcommittee is, are we looking small, or are we zooming out and looking at overall frameworks and big changes? And I think the answer is both, but I still would say keeping actionable in there as part of kind of what we've been assigned here, if that makes sense. And I would keep the significant and measurable as well. So those
Okay.
are my votes for now.
I can delete this if you all agree.
I'm good with deleting it.
All right.
Thank you.
I have a question. Sorry to jump in here.
Please.
Do we know whose policies and practices we're talking about? I mean, do we need to say that, or is it implied that everyone understands what that refers to?
I actually think that the ambiguity is potentially helpful.
Okay.
Because on the one hand, it could be GSA, but obviously, so GSA is the Lord High Emperor of commercial products, services, and buildings. But I think that if we could create policies and practices that would also help the Defense Department, I think that would be great. So I think it's a really big marketplace, but that's just my personal reaction to that ambiguity.
I agree with that, Steve. I think that I think we're not quite sure where we're going to land. I agree that ambiguity is helpful for us at this point. Any other thoughts on that?
So can I ask a process question? And I'm asking the group here. I'm really cognizant. Stacy reminded us earlier that, you know, many people are traveling. We obviously don't have the attendance we had last time. I'd be curious to hear what people think would be the best way to try to get the rest of the group and drive this to some kind of a vote. I mean, should we basically get as close as we can get today and basically say, here's what we have, vote yay or nay? Or should we try to break it into 2 or 3 iterations and ask people for some ranked voting and preferences? or should we just be more patient? I'm very, very open, but I'm curious.
So can I ask another administrative question? Boris, do we have I don't think we can vote today, right? I don't think we have.
Right, you wouldn't be able, but you can, I think Steve's first suggestion, you could definitely get this as close as it is comfortable for the group here, and then you can disseminate it to everybody, and then just go with that. I mean, that to me sounds like a reasonable approach, but it's your all's decision. But to answer your question, look, you would not have enough people to make it, but I think Steve's first idea makes sense to me.
And Luke, I think one thing that we could do, Rich just pitched another slightly revised version in here. And so, maybe what we do is put, a couple of versions of that in there. I don't know if you can pick that up off the chat and just drop it in there.
Yes.
Well,
And Rich, do you want to say a little bit more about what you were thinking there?
Yeah, this gets back to my point. I don't think our charter is to write more regs. And again, it gets back to the core philosophy of until the time that government builds its own government-owned factories, and stops relying on the private sector. More regulatory overhead is not necessarily going to be that helpful, and it'll be too slow. What we want to do is create a climate of appropriate industry incentives and demand generation to bring modern, sustainable goods and services into the federal government by leveraging the private sector. We want to leverage the private sector to step up to the plate here.
Yes. And
I'm coming from.
Can we just build on this thought for a second, Rich, and tell me if this is the direction you're going on? So I hear you, but I guess I would like to broaden it, because what I'm hearing you say is carrot and stick, incentives and disincentives, but the language is only carrot at this point.
Thank you, Steve. Bingo.
So if we could get some incentives, disincentives in there. So again, if I'm understanding where Rich is coming from, and a lot of this really resonates with me from a policy standpoint, we want to discourage just the mindless buying that ignores externalities, and we want to encourage demand for things that are less harmful and the like. I don't have the words yet in order, but I think that he's definitely onto something there. I'd be curious to hear what others think.
We want to discourage industry's parochial view that is looking at short-term profit and not baking those externalities into its product development, so that we can buy goods and services to achieve these goals. So Karen,
yeah. So, and I'm really curious to hear what others have to say about this. My sense is that this administration in particular is highly disinclined to open the door to, in effect, saying what Rich just said, which is, the automobile and the extractive and the airline industries, they have no intention of solving the problem. Their goal is to slow roll this and maintain profits as long as they can. And obviously, as a little subcommittee, we're not going to fix those issues. But I think what I hear Rich saying is we want to incentivize the marketplace to rethink their focus, whether it's on profit or growth or self-dealing or maintaining their destructive tendencies, and start thinking more creatively about more sustainable solutions. But boy, that's a big, long sentence.
Yeah, I know, Steve, but you do this by recrafting these large vehicles that create demand signals for the private sector by baking those goals and objectives into the requirements process rather than mandates, top-down mandates.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're agreeing. I'm just trying to figure out how to turn it into phraseology.
Yeah.
So Boris, is it possible to pluck Richard's version and throw it on the screen here?
Yeah, I was trying to do that.
I did annotate on the share drive, the mission statement, did that yesterday. Fewer words. I just don't have it here in front of me.
Yeah, for some reason I cannot do the copy and paste. Here, well, I can just type it. I just do that. I just type it.
So I mean, I think this is a good alternative. And I think this is not necessarily two different points of view that are completely incompatible with each other, and nor does A preclude doing B. The language in B is obviously a little more nuanced, and I think this is, this will be a good comparison for discussion with the broader group. What do you guys think?
So maybe going back to what we were talking about a few moments ago, let's let Boris finish typing, and then let's all think about any suggestions on the two, and then we can think about whether we want to give everybody a chance to basically edit first and then vote, or just basically ask people which direction they're going in, then agree, figure out which one's more popular, and then do the final tweaking of that at the next meeting. But again, I'm open on how to drive the group to something everybody can live with.
I want to, on the record, I am have no pride of any authorship in respects of these specific words. I think the mission statement should reflect carrots and sticks. That's where I'm coming from.
Yep. So Steve, I think that makes sense. I think we maybe ask for people's input. In the meantime, if there's an option 3 somebody wants to propose, otherwise come prepared to discuss pros, cons, suggested edits to option 1 and 2, and with a plan towards coming to an agreement at the next meeting.
Since we don't have that many others, before we wrap on this, Stacy, Jenny, David, is that basically it? Am I missing somebody? Any other thoughts before we move off this?
David, you have your hand up again?
Oh,
Yeah, I have a question. This is for Richard. I appreciate your articulation of this. I think it's a good idea. I guess as a non-economist, I'm kind of stuck on accelerate demand. So I'm trying to figure out which side of the table am I sitting on? Is this that through federal government action will get producers to produce more so that people will see the signal of more supply and demand it? Or is it, I'm just,
it's a free market orientation. It's an acknowledgement that it's the power and creativity of the private sector that's going to solve this problem, not government's issuance of additional binders of regulatory diktat. So I'm a free marketeer. Okay.
No, and I appreciate that. I mean, I'm just trying to figure out sort of what are so I'm an engineer, so I think of things like gears and levers and things like that, is like what is motivating, what is driving what. So
right. We create incentives. So I mean, the core philosophy, which we talked about at the very beginning, was that the government is the largest buyer of goods and services in the world. That's, Steve and I can argue that's not technically accurate, but anyway, set that aside. And it is a bit of a trope, but the government can create an environment of demand and business opportunity to create incentives for the private sector to step up and give us the things we need to achieve this goal and objective. And writing more FAR rules or amending FAR Part 15 or something that's not going to get us there, in my opinion.
yeah. And to Rich's point about what the government can and can't do. So for example, I think the Postal Service contract was an important moment in time, because it's so high profile. But obviously, the government is not a major vehicle purchaser in the grand scheme of things. But in terms of creating demands that drive down prices because things are being produced at higher quantities and more EV stations are available. So that's helpful. But we know that there's a lot of markets the government doesn't drive. So there's a lot of, I hate to use the term virtue signaling, but when the government signals, I go back to the discussion with Katie about food earlier. If the government suggests that we're going to change the mix of foods being offered in government cafeterias and the like, that sends a signal to the private sector that, oh, we're reacting to big issues and maybe you should play along. The question is at what point that becomes so amorphous that we're not saying anything?
So let me give an example of what I've sort of, hopefully this captures not my confusion, but it's the word demand that I'm kind of struggling with. Let's say government outlawed internal combustion engines. The only thing you could buy is something that wasn't, that certainly would create demand for electric vehicles because you didn't have a choice.
Yeah, California's doing that, by the way.
Right. So, but it also increases supply because now they can't produce them, so they have to increase the supply of other things. So it's kind of I'm not sure which we're referring to. That's kind of.
So could I offer one term of art, and maybe Rich will meet us in the middle here, or maybe not. But we often think about solutions to government needs. So I think what David just highlighted is it is often the case that the purchase of a good satisfies a government requirement or a need. But as we've seen, so many of you know that Rich has tremendous background in information technology. In our adult lifetime, we fundamentally changed the way that we've met that demand by not selling something as a good, but selling it as a service or a license. So many users don't buy software or even hardware. They buy the right to use other people's solutions. And so I think, for example, to David's point, you can outlaw the fossil fuel vehicle, but what I'd rather see the government do is discourage the use of them and encourage people to be using mass transit or the like. Now, again, we're drifting around acquisition, but I go back to the point that Richard made earlier, which is requirements can be far more impactful than acquisition or procurement. And it is frequently the case that procurement policy ends up trying to fix it because the other stuff is too hard and it requires more leadership. But again,
I think we can fit. I am leaning towards option 2 because I think we can satisfy David's question through how we define what we're talking about in that one. So if we're accelerating demand for sustainable goods and services, we may be saying that you cannot buy this thing that is worse. But we can also say that in order to buy that thing that's not as bad, you also have to do things to create the supply in a way that's equitable through the same kind of policy. So there's ways to do both. It's what's happening with the IRA funding for the low carbon procurement, where we have requirements about low carbon products and things that are going to say that you can only buy things that are lower carbon. At the same time, tons of money that's going towards the solutions that have to then decarbonize those products even farther or provide the things that will meet the requirement. So I just think we have the flexibility in the second one to be able to address both sides of things because it's broad enough, but it's also the demand word is super important to Richard's point, I think, and how we think about all this.
No, that's great, Stacey. That's really helpful. But maybe I'm also stuck on whose demand. So we're talking about the government's demand for things, or are we talking about somebody else's demand?
So what we've seen, where we've worked with the private sector first, demand is demand. Whether or not it's the private sector, like an Amazon or Microsoft, putting forth a policy or a statement that they're going to do this thing this way, that sends a market signal to the suppliers that large purchaser is going to do something differently. That can then be something that the federal government or someone on the public side can point to and actually buy into to increase the demand for that same thing. And it's starting to happen with some of this work around EPDs and embodied carbon. But I
Well,
don't think we want to get specific. It's just general demand, and a large procurer could help signal that demand and help others along in terms of what those requirements are.
And to Stacy's point, a very clear example is the government's demand for space launch services in the last 5 years has created a robust private sector alternative with SpaceX and Blue Origin that are now providing space launch as a service at pennies on the dollar compared to SLS and the big Lockheed Martin NASA Combine.
And what I really like about Rich's example, and again, not to get too far afield, but I actually got dragged into a National Academies panel on this very issue last year. And one of the things that has been really hard for the government to get used to is the government may be the primary consumer, but they are best off if they contribute to the market solution rather than try to dictate the market solution. And so everything from anchor tenant to using pre-existing commercial contracts to basically laying the investment out there to let the private sector drive it. I think that this is extremely consistent with the commercial product and service evolution of the last 20 or 30 years, and is consistent with the government having an important role on the demand side, but not being the ultimate driver of the market, rather being more of a nudger or an influencer. So Luke, what do you think? Do you think we're close enough on two options that we should think about? Okay.
I do. I really like the way that the discussion has gone. I mean, this is what you get when you have a diversity of minds all contributing to the whole here. I think we're going to wind up with something better, way better than what we started with. So I can't wait to hear hopefully another 9 voices or 10 voices next meeting to take us home. I'm not sure. So I think if there are no final thoughts, I think we can table this for the remainder of this meeting and move on to, I almost wonder, is it worth having a discussion about the priorities now with such a small group and still in the absence of a final priority? I mean, a final mission statement. What do you think?
Yeah, so part of me thinks that given it's such a small group, we don't need to spend the extra half hour just for the sake of spending it. But I do think that we shouldn't let everybody who's here off the hook without trying to prod a little bit on the speaker list. And so, what we could do is we could ask Boris to pull up the speaker list, or we could ask everybody to, if they have anybody in mind. I know Rich already mentioned that he's talking to Trissa Thompson about some folks there. I think that'd be great. And maybe we just ask who's remaining, if they have any thoughts on speakers, and then we'll prod that again later.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Why don't we do that? If you don't have an individual person, even just a topic you think we should have kind of high in our priority list of things to hear about. David, why don't you start?
And while we're doing that, Boris, can you pop up our speaker list and skip the yellow highlighted stuff, which was the example, and just go straight to?
I was going to ask a question rather than
Sure.
a person, and maybe Richard, you have somebody in mind, but do we have any examples of the acceleration of demand that we've kind of articulated in this current version of the mission statement?
I think the Postal Service contract that Steve's been talking about is going to accelerate demand for EVs. I mean, it's a big contract.
Yeah, and to Rich's point, I'm not sure that it's the only example, but one of the great things about that example is it's high impact in terms of the whole country is going to see more government EV vehicles on the road relatively soon, or sooner than they otherwise would have.
And if it morphs into school buses and utility vehicles and government, metro buses. I mean,
Now there was a garbage truck outside. There was an example of an EV garbage truck yesterday.
some of those exist already.
Yeah.
You know, I'm in my real job. I deal with end of life of things, and EV batteries are big in that. I'm just wondering if there are supply constraints, and it's just a matter of, is this going to be cannibalizing the market? Sort of you squeeze a balloon at one end and the other one pops out, or and I think it's a good example. I just think it has its own unique attributes.
No,
I
it's
don't know
true.
if they're all going to be like that, or they're going to be something perhaps more subtle.
You know, as in my previous life as the chief supply chain lawyer for Michael Dell for many years, I mean, our e-waste situation was awful. That was shameful.
Let's have an offline conversation about that.
And since we're on that topic, one of the really popular e-recycling firms in the DC metro area is located in my neighborhood in Falls Church. So we can talk about that too. So let me just suggest this real quick, and I'm going to do this very, very quickly. But Boris, if you could just scroll up again, just go back, other direction. No, where the white page starts. Okay, so if you go on to the shared drive, what we have here is we have a pending invitation to Porter Glock, who is the person in the Office of Federal Procurement Policy with the primary portfolio on this. And then I'll come back to that in a moment. We have one other pending invitation. But because the FAR rule is so focused on assessment, disclosure, and targeting, one thing that we might think about is bringing in some speakers on that, or possibly bringing somebody in on SBTI. But let me also mention on that we could just basically expect our community to learn this stuff on themselves, because the greenhouse gas protocol has a lot of available online training. So again, something to think about. Okay, next, the global best practice in terms of what I'm seeing outside the country talks in terms of life cycle cost, or rather than focusing on low purchase prices, internalizing the externalities. And we could bring in a speaker on how life cycle cost analysis permits procurement officials to reorient their thinking about value. Personally, that's to me is a game changer, but I realize that may be a little bit much for some. The next one in there.
Hey, Steve,
sorry, please.
before moving from there, I think you've got a couple members on your subcommittee that are LCCA, Dr. Amlan Mukherjee. You got at least one, maybe two, that could even, speak to that topic. So just a comment on that.
And we talked
Steve,
about,
I want to make the distinction between life cycle cost analysis and life cycle analysis, because they're two different things.
Right.
So I want to make sure that we are talking about, we're sure what we're talking about there.
So, and again, I'm open to both, and I think that the distinction is an important one. Again, since Rich and I have done far too much thinking about the way that acquisition professionals think, to me, the power of LCCA in terms of the cost analysis is it permits, I don't want to say closed-minded, but conventional thinkers to get off the low purchase price to internalize the externalities. In other words, how do I justify paying the price premium for, again, I'll use the example of a hybrid vehicle or an EV, not a perfect example, but why shouldn't I just buy the least expensive thing like I've been doing because I live in a budget constrained world? And what we're seeing, at least my experience, is LCCA empowers people to think more broadly about climate mitigation in terms of what the purpose of government is and what government should actually be paying for. But that's my perspective.
Yeah, I think I think maybe my recommendation would be maybe someone that can define the differences between life cycle cost analysis and life cycle analysis and how they play into procurement. Because life cycle cost analysis, working on the Skanska side, when we were working with public projects like schools, the budgets that they have to spend on the procurement of the materials for the school versus the operational budget to keep the school maintained are separate budgets. So it's really hard for them to look at that long-term cost maintenance and be able to see the benefits of saving that, because it's a different person that's in charge of the money to buy the thing than it is to operate. That's life cycle costing. Life cycle analysis is where you can bring the carbon data and the environmental impact data next to the cost data for the procurement. So they're very different in terms of what you're looking at.
And
So
the
it
re-
may be that we need people to understand the differences between the two and how they both play into procurement.
I think that would be valuable. And again, I don't want to dig in my heels, but one of the reasons why I think we do want to be doing life cycle cost analysis, going back to Rich's point, is if we make this merely a procurement problem and we don't bring the requirements generators and the senior leadership in, we're just nibbling at the edges. And I think that the people who are doing the bigger thinking are the ones, as you say, who have to think about purchase price, capital expenditures, operating costs, and everything in the long run. Because, as you say, once the issue's been given to the procurement official, it's too late to make the good decision. But lots of options there. May I suggest, however, particularly if you have recommendations, go ahead and add them on there, and we can think about dividing that up. The next one on here, the Chancery Lane project, this may or may not be of interest to people, but this is a global group of people who are basically thinking about standard terms and conditions that might be helpful. The next one in here, we've talked about this before. Jeff Kozis had encouraged us to hear from the Oasis team, who's drafting an RFP, and Rich mentioned Alliant as well. And then the last one, oh, sorry.
Hey, Steve, can I jump in on this one? So we have been talking to the key leader there at GSA on Oasis Plus. So Stephanie and I had a meeting with her yesterday. Fascinating. I think that's a really interesting opportunity. And then we're trying to get a hold of the Alliant team leader, Lauren Stanton at GSA, who's kind of the senior leader over that group. I used to work for Laura, incidentally. And so I think bringing both of them, and we're thinking about for the full committee, potentially in the January meeting. And I think, Steve, you have suggested that at one time. But we're thinking both Oasis Plus and the Alliance Re, because they are, I think, Rich very well summarized what's going on with both of them. So that's in the works for the full committee.
Yeah, it was Matt Berholst. We did the briefing on Alliant.
Okay. And he probably works for Laura Stanton. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. We know Laura.
Yep. Yep. So those are two programs anyway that we're reaching out to.
Okay. And then if you scroll down,